That's great. Spencer, if we could ask you to share the slides, that would be very useful. Great. And thank you again, Emily, for that introduction. It's funny how the screen changes here as we begin to share the slides. So my name is Frank Stone. I'm a project manager at New Ecology, and I'm joined here by Spencer Gorman, assistant project manager at New Ecology. And what we're going to hope to share with you today is a set of resilient design tools that we use in our practice that we've written a report on. That report is available to you on the website and also has been shared as part of the invitation today. And these resilient design tools, again, are things that we use in our practice. They're publicly available and free to use, and we hope you find them useful in your practice as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. So I think we're all quite familiar with the challenges and changes that are happening around in Massachusetts and the pressures that are going to come, whether they be from extreme heat, increased precipitation and flooding, or sea level rise and storm surge. So what we're sharing with you today are publicly available tools that development teams can use to forecast these risks out through 2070. And we're also putting together and sharing with you some resources that can be used to plan to mitigate those risks, whether they be at upcoming renovations or whether they be brought into consideration for new construction projects. And we'd like to share those with you today so that you can bring them into your own practice, as I shared before. We will use an example today, 170 Cottage Street in Chelsea, Mass. And if we can go to the next slide, we'll give you an example of what the space looks like. So 170 Cottage Street in Chelsea is, at the time of these photos, was undeveloped. The Chelsea Creek, as you can see on the slide to the right, is located to the south and southeast of the site, and the lowest elevation is about 14 feet above sea level. If we can go to the next slide, we can take a look at how we can begin to assess some of the risks there. So one of the first tools that I'd like to bring to your attention, and this is written up in the report in greater detail, is the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool put out by the Mass RMAT team. And what this tool does is it takes about 1 or 2 hours to learn, and it will give you a pretty comprehensive understanding of the risks at the property out through 2070. And if I can direct your attention to the lower right of the screen, it categorizes them in one of these menus in these 4 ways, looking at sea level rise and storm surge risk, extreme precipitation risk and the flooding that comes from that, riverine flooding from extreme precipitation, and also extreme heat. And for this particular property, what we see is that there's moderate risk from sea level rise and storm surge. There's high risk from flooding from extreme precipitation, a word I'm having trouble saying today, I don't know why, and extreme risk or high risk from extreme heat. And what this tool really does let you do is it lets you define the boundary of your site and understand what the specific risks are there. It also draws on one of the most comprehensive and advanced flood risk models available right now, and that's the Mass Coastal Flood Risk Model put together by Woods Hole. So if there's one tool here that I can encourage you and your teams to put 1 to 2 hours towards to learn and use, it would be this Climate Resilience Design Standards tool. If we can go to the next slide. And by the way, down at the bottom of each of these slides, we've linked to the tools that we're talking about in each slide to try to make this as easy as possible for you to use. So why do I find this tool so valuable? One of the reasons is the output that you can see here. With the site boundary marked out, we can look at the flood risk for this specific site. So this is the 0.5% flood risk chance, aka the 200-year expected flood for the site in 2030, 2050, and 2070. And the MCFRM, the Mass Coastal Flood Risk Model, is looking ahead in pretty granular detail to help teams understand what the specific flood risk is and how it will change over time. So I find this tool to be quite valuable. Again, I'd expect it to take about 1 to 2 hours to get used to. You have to register for an account, but it is free to use, as are all of these tools we're presenting today. And we'd encourage you to spend a few minutes to learn them if you don't already know them, and you very well may. And at this point, I'll turn it over to Spencer Gorman to talk about a few other tools. Thank you.
Thanks, Frank. Yeah, this tool is great for evaluating flood risk because it's forward-looking. It looks at future data, and a lot of other tools are more based on more historical research. So we need to consider how environmental conditions are going to change because our buildings have long lifespans. They will face these conditions in 20, 50, 100 years. Tools like this help us gauge what type of conditions our buildings will be facing over that lifespan. And from there, we can approach planning for how to make them resilient when they face those challenges. So this tool is good for looking at future risk, but there are still some great resources for considering current flood risk exposure. I was saying it's key to look ahead, but we can't overlook the risks facing our buildings.
How are you?
Facing our buildings
I'm
right now.
just checking to see if everything is good with the painting, with the repairs that we need.
Lena, if you can just mute, I think you're unmuted. Thanks.
Okay.
Thank you, Lena. Yeah, but we can't overlook the risk facing our buildings currently. It can have regulatory implications, but
okay, maybe when we do the survey of the unit, and after that, if something happens.
Lena, I think you're
yeah.
still unmuted, Lena. If you can mute, or Dawn, if you can mute Lena, that can work as well. Oh, perfect. There you go.
Yeah, looking at current flood risk is important to have regulatory implications, but importantly, it's what us and our community members are facing in our day-to-day lives. So these tools are a little more straightforward. I'd say 30 minutes or so is really all you need to look through these ones quickly. We can go through them. The first tool is from NOAA. We have the link to the tool at the bottom of the slide down here. And like Frank said, the report we wrote goes into more depth on some of the technical stuff for figuring these out. Right now, we're just trying to share the overview of these tools. So this tool, it looks at storm surge. Storm surge is one of the two types of flooding that a hurricane can cause. It can rain a lot, or two, the wind, the waves, and tide can work together to basically just push the ocean up onto the land. That's the storm surge. So this tool shows the potential depth of that surge for different severities of hurricanes. The screenshot we have going here is showing a Category 4 hurricane, which would be record breaking for our area, but we are going to see more hurricanes with warmer weather. With this tool, you can't zoom in very well, but we can still search up our example property 170 Cottage Street, and we can see it's roughly on the edge of the storm surge zone here. One thing I should note is that this map, it looks pretty bad. The red area being 9 feet deep of storm surge, covering a pretty huge chunk of Boston. But no single storm is going to cause all this. NOAA made this tool by modeling a bunch of different iterations of Category 4 storms, different landfalls and trajectories, and then they layered all the worst cases on top of each other. So basically, this is a worst case map, but again, it's helpful to gauge the potential conditions our buildings might face in the future. The second tool I was going to talk about is from FEMA, and some of you may have seen these FEMA flood maps before. You can view them online pretty easily with this link. And the granularity of them is definitely better, but the interpretation can be a little more difficult in my opinion. But using these maps, we can identify two key pieces of information for our properties. Is a property in a flood hazard zone? And what is the base flood elevation of that flood hazard zone? On the map, we can see that 170 Cottage it's not in a flood hazard zone, but we do see zone AE on the map. So briefly, if a property is located in zones that start with an A, so zone AE, or zones that start with a V, FEMA designates these as being in the danger zone for a 1%, or like Frank was saying, a 1 in 100-year storm. If 170 Cottage was in that zone, having to purchase flood insurance or other requirements might apply, like having to build the first level at the base flood elevation, or in some cases above the base flood elevation. Yeah. So elevating living spaces above the base flood elevation is one type of design strategy to address flood risk in our buildings. But there are a lot of other design strategies to consider. And flood risk it's not the only climate risk facing our buildings. So I'll hand it back to Frank to talk about another tool to evaluate applicable design strategies for particular buildings.
Great, thanks, Spencer, and thanks for the overview of those tools as well. If we can go on to the next slide, please, that'll be helpful. So great, thank you again. So what we looked at so far is some of the ways to diagnose some of the risks at a given site. Again, the RMAT tool is quite useful and quite comprehensive, and the other tools, the NOAA tool and the FEMA flood risk maps, take a look at those specific risks as well. So now that we've presented those, we'd like to talk a little bit about ways to begin to think about mitigating some of those risks. And a few years ago, New Ecology, along with Kleinfelter for the Department of Housing and Community Development, put together a number of resources to help teams understand what can be done to mitigate some of these risks. So you'll see here on the right a graphic representation of some of the strategies that can be used to retrofit existing projects, and can also be used at new properties as needed. Things like, should we install flood walls? Should we make sure that we have sump pumps in the basement? Should we elevate mechanicals or generators? Do we need to have a cool roof at our property? And we've done this type of a graphic for two typologies: a multifamily building, as shown here, and also for a side-by-side duplex construction. So that's another typical Mass DHCD funded housing typology that we find in Massachusetts. So those graphical resources will help teams to begin to discuss strategies that they need. That's totally fine. Please go on to the next one, and we can talk about some of the others. So as part of the CHARM project, we also developed a rapid risk and vulnerability assessment tool. So this is a more granular level tool that's designed to be used on site at a property. It's an Excel tool. It can also be printed out and used with pen and paper on site if teams prefer. And what it is 26 questions that are yes or no format to help diagnose specific risks. If there is no risk, if a particular risk isn't at a property and the answer is no, then that's great, you can move on. And if the answer is yes, you'll see on the right-hand column that there are applicable strategies that can be used to mitigate or remediate that risk, whether that's at a renovation or whether it's done in a more urgent way. So this tool is designed really to let teams who know the property walk through and to diagnose some of these risks. And if we can go on to the next slide, we can take a look at, once you know what the risks are, there are also design and construction guidelines that were compiled by DHCD, but we added in some materials on resiliency. And if we can click through these three overlays and have them all out here, what we've done is put together the risk factors from the climate change impacts and put in specific mitigation strategies into the construction specification. So this will give teams an idea of how they can mitigate a specific risk at a renovation or a retrofit. So those tools are also available to you all, linked at the link down below. Next slide, please. So two more tools to share with you, and one of them is a REopt tool put out by the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So at this point, teams have gone through and understood what many of the risks are and what many of the mitigation strategies are. And we often get questions in teams hoping to put some more specific financial numbers to renewables and especially backup batteries as those become more popular for resilient spaces. So this tool helps teams to understand the financials of what they're dealing with, and it gets quite specific. You can either use standard stock inputs, or you can use inputs specific to your project. So all of the financial data can be tweaked by the team to the level that the team likes, and to then go out and test the resiliency to understand if the commitment is to this system size and backup battery size, what does that give us in terms of resilient performance during an outage? And then to go back through and iterate, so you can save those and iterate and find the ideal system size for your team's needs. We find this tool to be quite useful. Again, it really helps with financial predictions, and it helps teams to go back and be able to build different models and iterations of what they're looking at. If we can go to the next slide, I'll give you a brief overview of one of the things it can do for you. And so what we're seeing here is a graphic that may be a little bit too complicated, but this is the REopt tool. And what it's doing is it's assessing a battery backup system that's solar connected. And it's assessing its ability to withstand a power outage that the user has set. So in this case, I set it for a 48-hour power outage in the middle of the summer, starting 1 a.m. on July 1st and going until 1 a.m. on July 3rd. And with a 5% building load, so expecting to back up a resilient space, can this combination of solar power and battery backup last throughout the outage? And what we're finding here from this model, this predictive model, is that it can. And so that gives some confidence that the team could put battery backup to a resilient space and have that space withstand an outage. This is another detail that teams can go in and tweak. You can change the loads, you can change the system sizes, and find a system that fits for your team. Next slide, please. And the last asset that I'll draw your attention to is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network Guide to Developing Resilience Hubs. So we just spoke about putting battery backup and solar interconnection into a resilience hub. How do you go through the process of designing a resilience hub? What are the steps that can be taken? And how do you make this both a site that serves community needs during a time of crisis or outage, providing heating, cooling, charging, and other services? And how do you make it a useful community space during normal times of normal operation? And so what this guide does is it's quite graphically oriented. It helps teams walk through a step-by-step process from the early design phase to understand what the steps are to creating an effective resilience hub in the property. And I really like that they've taken the time to do that in great detail and to share their process as they've gone through it before. So I'm happy to have made you all aware of, if you didn't already know, some of these resources. If we can go to the next slide. What we have tried to present to you is tools to diagnose the risk. So that's the RMAT tool, the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool, the NOAA and the FEMA flood risk maps. Those are also available to you. And then to look at some of the specific tools that can help you scope and scale renewable energy and battery backup systems, the REopt tool. To also let you know about the CHARM resources that the DHCD team, along with Kleinfelter and New Ecology, put together. So those are all, again, freely available to you. And then as teams go to put together those resilience hubs and work through their needs there, the USDN has put together some really great resources to help you all do that. So that is the summary of what we've hoped to do today. Again, this record is basically to go through, in summary, what we've written down in the report. And the report is in the case study format, and it's available to you all on the website. And again, through the invitation today. Please feel free to reach out to either Spencer or myself if you have any questions or you'd like to talk through any details. And we'll stop now for questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frank and Spencer. We really appreciate it. And there's a couple questions and comments in the chat. And I'm wondering, Dave, if you want to go ahead and unmute, you can feel free to ask your question if you're able to, or if not, we can ask it.
Sure. Yeah, I'm going to assume that was Dave Schmidt. And it was just a curiosity. I'm sorry if it's distracting, but I just wanted to confirm that map where we're showing in red, all those areas were actually they're predicting 9 feet of surge waters at all of those locations in red, or that surge was would be measured somewhere else at 9 feet, and it would impact with some severity all those areas in red.
Thanks, Dave, for the question. I may refer to or defer to Spencer on that one. I think he's more familiar with that particular tool. Spencer?
Yeah, I'll go back to that map. So NOAA made this map. There's a risk map for each category of hurricanes at the top. For category 4, the screenshot, NOAA made this map by running a bunch of simulations of category 4 hurricanes making landfall, like all different locations, simulations with all different trajectories, all different winds, not wind speed, that'd be a different category, but every option of category for hurricanes. And then for each of those, they modeled potential depth of storm surge. And then for all those different models, they layered them on top of each other and called it maximum of maximum. So in one hurricane, there could have been, so for one possible hurricane, for one, say this property right here, if the hurricane made landfall at the worst possible trajectory in the worst possible location, the worst possible outcome would be 9 feet of storm surge. I don't know if I explained that correctly, but yes, so like maximum of maximum, the worst possible case in all these locations could be 9 feet of storm surge, yes.
Thanks, that's clarifying and useful context too. Appreciate it.
Of course.
Great.
Great question as well.
And then Alyssa, I think you mentioned about how the Western Mass doesn't necessarily have some of the floodplain mapping digitally. Did you want to, that's good, really good feedback to hear. And I wonder if you want to add any additional details there, and or if Frank and Spencer want to speak to that, that lack of data in Western Mass communities and how we can overcome that.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not up to date on what FEMA's schedule is for digitizing and updating the firms in Western Mass. I know they were in process in a lot of the communities because our floodplain data layers are from the 70s and 80s, so they're quite old. But I know that I know that Mass Mapper, I think, digitized those paper firms for planning purposes. But I guess I'm curious if that's included in the climate resiliency tool, if it's that kind of digitized layer or not. But when I went to the FEMA site, it looks like it's still showing that a pretty large area of Western Mass the digitized maps aren't complete yet. So just noting that mainly, that if you're in those communities, the FEMA site doesn't have that information.
Thanks for that note, Alyssa. I don't know the answer to whether or not the Climate Resilience Design Standards tool has done something more to update. I'm not sure if the MCFRM addresses the Western Mass properties. I just don't know the answer to that, but I'm happy to look into it. So far, I've analyzed properties only on the coast, but I'll follow up and try to see if I can come up with some better information on that and relay that to Emily.
Thank you, Frank, and thanks, Alyssa, for bringing that up. Great point. So it sounds like if others have questions, please just raise your hand or throw them in the chat. I have a question. So it sounds like basically, whether you have a new construction or existing building, you can use some of the first tools to identify what's the risk for this area, maybe in terms of flooding and or heat. And then from there, kind of what's the first step would you recommend for building level upgrades, or where do they go next once they know what the vulnerabilities are? Would they go to New Ecology for additional research? Are there a certain tool that you would recommend starting with to really make, how to inform which upgrades you're making based on the risks that you're having? Like, how do you work through that process?
Yeah, thank you, Emily, for the question. I think for the team to go through and understand what the risks are is an important first step. And then honestly, I would recommend the teams take those back to the design team to understand what can be done to mitigate and what adjustments want to be made or need to be made. So for example, here we saw some flood risk at one corner of the site. So maybe that would inform the design or somehow change things. And that may that may also be considerations for the mechanical engineer, for the plumbing system, if backwater valves were to be included, and to carry that through with the design team. We're also happy to meet and talk with teams about some of their specific needs, if there are any. But I think often on new construction buildings, a next step may be to bring this information back to the team and think about what the mitigation strategies are that are available for properties that are being retrofit. We'd be happy to talk through with teams on what can be done. And we've done resilience opportunity assessments in the past, looking at specific strategies to mitigate specific risks, especially when we find a site that has something like flood risk and maybe is next to an area with combined sewers where there's some potential for things like backflow. So we'd be happy to do that at existing properties. And I'd recommend as a next step, I'm being a little bit repetitive here and I apologize for that, but I think taking this back to the design team would be an important place to go.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. That's super helpful. Courtney, go for it.
Hello. Courtney from Beacon Communities. I had two questions, one's more technical and one's more philosophical. So the first one, I know that LISC has a whole web page of toolkits and resources. Are all of these links part of that somehow? I'm looking at it now and I don't know if I would be able to go there and then link to all these different tools.
Yeah, so we'll send around the link. Let me actually send it right here. This is and we'll also include this in the follow-up materials. But this is the direct link to the resilient design brief, which all of these tools are listed there in, I think, page 5. You can download them all, or you can, it hyperlinks to all 7 of them or so. Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, so that's helpful. And then the philosophical question. So I am currently working on a new construction development in Salem that we're needing to make it a climate resilient building. It's on the cove. We know water comes in now, it will come in the future. And we've designed, I think, as a really climate resilient building with building up the garage level under the podium, and the residential units are well above the first ground floor units, well above the 2070 floodplain. Like, we really thought about it. But people ask me all the time, should we be rebuilding on this site? It will flood. And I just had a meeting with the residents yesterday and said, who are asking this question, there's currently 50 units of state public housing, all on the ground level, built in the 50s. They won't work to renovate those for many reasons, including them being in the floodplain. And I did say we're building up the basement, like podium level garage, to 10 feet is today's floodplain level. That's where your buildings are now. We're going to build it up to 11 ground floor residential units at 22 feet above sea level. In a flood, you will have to move your cars. In a flood, you will be able to shelter in place where everyone else in Salem is going to have to leave. But you probably will be an island for a period of time. And it's passive house and all electric, so they could probably stay there comfortably for weeks and be okay. But I still don't know if this is the right thing to be doing. And I wanted to see if that could be part of the conversation we had now or at another time about, land is precious. It's already affordable housing. It's owned by the Salem Housing Authority. It was 50 units. It's going to be 124 units, all affordable. We're checking all the boxes of what you want to do in a development and doing a development in a floodplain. But should we have looked at other properties a housing authority owned and put it up on a hill? Probably, but we're not. And are we going to regret this? Maybe some of us are regretting all the spray foam we put in our buildings all these years. That seems so good. Are we? Yeah.
Thank you, Courtney. It's such a good question. I'd be really interested in hearing others on how you're tackling this. I know it's not like a black and white issue by any stretch of the imagination. And I think there's pros and cons to both sides. Lena, I'm seeing your others. What do you think about this? Anyone? Bueller?
I think that the philosophical question is a really good one, because maybe we have floods that is only 100 years, but this is what we have now for 100 years. Maybe in 20 years, that is going to be every 10 years. And what is going to happen with all the infrastructure that need to support the housing? So it's going to be all the infrastructure under the water. So it's going to be people just living in like these kind of buildings like we do in the coastal areas in, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think we probably do have to do some like planned retreat, but it's a political will question, right? How much more money are you going to get to be able to acquire property that's up, in a safer location in terms of flooding, right? Yeah, it's an equity issue. Others, is anybody else struggling with that? Have you found resources, promising practices? Courtney, I think it's a great idea of, you're elevating, you're going to be, people will be able to shelter in place theoretically, but to your point, all the food, the Medicaid, right? Like there will need to be, they'll shelter in place until they'll have to boat out of there or something. So really,
I have these visions that will all be hanging boats on the side of multifamily buildings at some point in the future for safety, like you do on a cruise ship.
Yeah, and I think I think there is some resources, especially down in the Gulf, where they are thinking a little more about how you live with water as opposed to kind of trying to just keep it out. And so that's probably going to be a new design feature as we move into this new reality. Others, Zoe, I see you unmuted.
Yeah, I was just thinking, we were looking at a potential piece of property close to the seaport area, and I'm thinking like, why would we even be like talking about this? But yet people are putting tens of millions of dollars in investment in a community that is absolutely, this is not just like a question maybe in the 100-year flood, whatever. This is like actively flooding locations. And there's development all over the seaport. And I think it's like we are in a land constrained community and we have a desperate need for affordable housing. And I think like we're just doing, the thing is, the affordable buildings are going to be just as much at risk as every other building in Salem or Seaport or whatever. And like, we're all just doing as much as we can, I think, to make it as resilient and sustainable as possible, with equipment on the roofs or, depending on how we structure our foundations or whatever. It's just, although I will say, I was like definitely a proponent of walking very quickly away from the Seaport, the Seaport site.
Yeah. No, totally understandable.
But I feel you, Courtney. Like it is real, but it's everybody. It's everybody. It's not just us who's grappling with this.
I think this also. Oh, go ahead, Frank.
Oh, thanks, Emily, and thanks, Zoe. I was just going to add, Courtney. It sounds like you're doing everything you can given the site, and I wonder, and I don't think this is politically possible, but I wonder if I think I've actually walked that specific site that you're referring to, and I'm wondering if there would be any way to sell off the site. It really has some great sight lines, and sell it to a developer who would create some private housing there where folks could stomach the risk and then use that funding to move the site elsewhere. I know that's a whole lot of logistics to consider, but I wonder if that type of a model, I can imagine that site being quite desirable for market rate housing. So I will just put that out there, but it does sound like you're doing everything you can given the site.
At this point, we've got our 40B permitting money applications into DHCD on a one-step round. Like this ship has sailed. It's happening, but I still have some trepidation about it. But I hear you in general, but then we're just but my question wasn't actually specifically about us, the affordable housing and like, multifamily development as much as anybody. So you just be kind of putting that on someone else's future problem.
I think the market is underpricing this risk a lot, but that's just a personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I hear you.
Agree. I wouldn't buy any property close to the water.
Yeah, and that may change things, right? As the insurance industry starts to price differently, that's maybe what's going to move folks inland. And just, I'll welcome if Rebecca wants to share a little bit about her resiliency hub idea. I know that this kind of brings up this larger issue, right, of where we've got maybe certain affordable housing projects have community centers or some level of shelter in place ability, but for not all properties are going to have that ability. So how can we coordinate among these different centers, like to create a resource hub of sorts across different, in Salem and Boston and, in Springfield, wherever it may be, to ensure that there are places people can go shelter in place or get, medication power, like access to refrigeration, things like that. But Rebecca, I wanted to invite you, if you wanted to share a little about your work on that.
Yeah, it's just really, well, first of all, it's great to see so many people here today, and we're really just at the very beginning stages, but we've been thinking a lot about, and I work mostly in Boston, but not exclusively, how the city does have cooling centers, mostly in senior housing and public housing, but, there are a few limitations. One is they're not everywhere, right? So you have areas where there just isn't something easily accessible, but also, even if there's one relatively close, like quarter-mile away, which would normally be a 5 or 10 minute walk, in extreme heat for an 85-year-old, like that's not going to work. So I've been thinking about a couple of things. One is doing some mapping so that to identify the census tracts that are most vulnerable to extreme heat, so that we could figure out what resources there are, and that in those areas or neighborhoods where they are not, we could look at opening up our buildings. So I work at the Jamaica Plain NDC, and so we have some elderly housing in Jamaica Plain between like Jackson Square and Stony Brook. There's no public housing there. There's no community housing, but both of these buildings have big community rooms, and we could make them a community resource. We could turn them into a cooling center, and that could be a magnet for everyone in Jamaica Plain. And, Urban Edge has some property near us, but of course their people are welcome in our cooling center, right? Like, why do we both need to, so one is like really looking at where there are the resiliency and the supports. To me, this is a really crucial racial equity issue. As Frank said, like people in the Seaport are going to be taken care of, but for the low-income folks who live in our housing or near our housing, to the extent we have market rate folks near us, I think it's a great boon, because we sometimes tussle with them over zoning and other things, but if we're providing something that will help them and their family and their neighbors, it is only going to build goodwill. So one is about siting and making sure we have cooling centers at reasonable distances. And that's kind of, someone would say, kind of like a hardware issue. But I think there's also kind of a software issue, because in extreme heat, it is hard, especially for elders, to walk very far. And a friend sort of said to me, I won't take credit for the idea, like maybe, and again, just thinking about the city of Boston, but it's applicable everywhere. Maybe the city needs to, instead of like, to some extent, building lots more cooling centers, maybe the city needs to put out a contract for an electric bus that during heat waves is going to run a route and just really pick people up so that no one has to walk more than 2 blocks. And that's actually not going to be that much money, right? But maybe there's, when you think about kind of the software side, maybe we have to make sure we have resources for people in extreme weather, but also we need to really think creatively. I'm sure people on this call have many more ideas. This is just the very beginning of thinking about it, about what we can do so that everyone who needs it will have access to the supports to survive extreme weather.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's, yeah, really great point. And
I'm at the JPNDC. Folks can I put in the chat, but I'm on my phone, but people are welcome. I would love to hear other people's ideas about this. We're just starting to think about it. Welcome everyone else's input.
I hate to ask this question because it's a worst question to ask. Do you know if you have to have different, do you're concerned about insurance coverage and whether inviting people into your low-income housing tax credit property is gonna, I mean, I'm essentially doing this at a couple of properties and I haven't decided if I'm allowed to advertise it to the broader community or if it's just for our residents.
Yeah, I mean, we we have community rooms and we host community meetings. And to us, it's just a normal part of the type of housing we build, and if the city councilor wants our community room for a meeting, we don't make people sign a release when they walk in. It's just part of what we do. That said, I haven't had anyone slip and fall and break their neck in this situation. So, worst case, I guess you have people do a release, but, we do, when you think about it, we have people coming in and out of our buildings all the time. We have home health dates, we have relatives, we have grocery delivery, everyone's coming in and out of our buildings all the time. I mean, we're not inviting people to come move in and sleep without a lease for weeks on end, but hopefully.
thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, and good question, Courtney. Zoe, I see your hand up.
Oh, I was just going to say, we talk about resiliency like on every project sort of generally, we do a lot of work with New Ecology early on in our charrette process. And we have, we're exclusively a senior housing developer, owner, property manager. And so I think we put a lot more spaces on our generators than your typical sort of multifamily housing project. We have an elevator always on the generator. We have, outlets throughout the building where people can plug in, medical device equipment. We have refrigerators that are always going to survive a power outage that will can store medication or food. We always create in all of our projects these what we call areas of refuge, where we have like a heating and cooling system that can in a space of the building that the entire building can come gather in the event of an extended power outage. So I would say we've been doing that for quite a while now. I think our biggest question is how big can we make this generator, and how can we fit this this generator, and right now all of our generators have been are diesel, and it's what is the next phase of generator? Are we looking at doing battery generators? Is there a way to connect the generator to the PV system? I think, but for us in terms of resiliency, making the building, and our residents, comfortable for an extended power outage has been key, a key part of our planning for a number of years.
That's great, Zoe. Thank you. And I know you all are working on battery storage for backup generation, right? And I know some others are too. So jump in if anyone wants to share their experience in that area. But yeah, I think that's a really good, that areas of refuge. Is that something, Zoe, that you have a basis of design for? How do you decide how big the area is, or what, right?
Yeah, I mean, the common areas in all of our buildings are always, a little bit, we're now, for all of our new projects, we're trying to create spaces that are multifunctional. And so we don't necessarily have one room in the building that can house all of the residents of the building, but, through movable walls or whatever, we want to create a space that can house everybody in the building, not just in the case of emergency, but for the 5 times a year or whatever, where we try and invite everybody to spend time together. And basically we just put that space on one, VRF, where we are, and that one VRF is connected to the generator in the case of an extended power outage. So it's nothing fancy or super technical. It's just, spaces within the building. And in an ideal world, we could have the entire building heated and cooled in a power outage, but that's just completely unrealistic.
That's a great idea. Great. Others? We have a little bit of time left, and go, Frank. Yeah.
Yeah, Emily, I may just share back to Rebecca. Rebecca, I heard, there are a number of different questions in there and some maybe about mobility. And what I would do is just, I would say that the USDN network has done some really excellent work on thinking through items like this. And so I'd recommend, to check out the resources and the work they've done. And Kristen Baja, who's put together a number of these resources, has really, done some great things and may have a solution to the question or parts of the question that you posed. And so I think basically, this is me saying they've got a number of great resources and have thought through some of these things, and there may be solutions there that you can draw on. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Frank. So that's that USDN Resilience Hub. And that's right. I think that's the last resource that we overview in the toolkit.
That's right. And they've got other resources as well. So that's, yes, they've got other resources as well. Thank you.
Good. Well, thank you everyone for this, conversation. And obviously this is an area where we're learning, I think, in real time, and there's some really promising practices and then challenges that folks are finding. So really appreciate you everyone sharing your expertise with the group and your learnings. And so just, I have a few announcements on resources that are coming up, and then if others have any announcements, welcome you to shout it out to the group. So we're excited that there are a ton of decarbonization resources on the horizon. I think many of you have heard that the Department of Energy Resources, they just came out with a $50 million bucket that's called Low and Moderate Income Housing Decarbonization Grant Program. So it's a mouthful, but it's statewide funding. It is due by June 1st. That's the first round. And it's providing up to $50,000 per unit for significant decarbonization and electrification in existing buildings. So definitely we'll share this list of the ones that we're tracking, but definitely make sure that's on your radar if you have properties that are coming up for rehab. The Mass Housing and MHP also has the Climate Ready Housing Partnership that LISC administers. That pre-app is due March 31st. So if you do have a deep energy retrofit project that would be achieving at least 50% energy savings, we can take pre-applications. And then Mass Save will be talking more in a couple weeks about their income eligible. They're new of the lean program, has the typical incentives, and then there's the deep energy retrofit incentives that are going to be finalized by April, early April. And so we'll have them present in a couple weeks on Thursday, April 6th, again at 1 o'clock, and we'll record that for folks if you can't make it. That's probably going to be in the area of $15,000 to $20,000 per unit is what we're seeing for at least 40% energy savings. And then the City of Boston, the Mayor's Office of Housing just came out with their large buildings green energy retrofits program. This is a $10 million bucket, and it's going to provide up to $50,000 per unit, again, for significant energy efficiency and in decarbonization. It's at least 50% energy savings, either upfront or over time. So if you have properties in Boston, definitely get your applications in. That's due toward the end of September. So those are 4 of the resources that we're tracking. And obviously many of you are involved in advocacy for things like the Zero Carbon Renovation Fund, and which would provide, another $300 million for equitable building decarbonization resources to the affordable housing sector and other priority environmental justice communities and other priority sectors. So, and then there's all the federal resources that we're tracking, and we'll try to keep folks abreast of as we learn more. And maybe, there's things to sign today, I think, that are coming out that are, we don't want to have rollbacks of some of these enacted Inflation Reduction Acts. So if you see those, please sign those as well against rollbacks there. So those are, I think, the announcements that we had for today. But if anyone else has resources or ideas, things you wanted to share with the group now or later, raise your hand or feel free to email Dawn and myself and Silvana, and we'll just get it out to the team. Thank you. Courtney, go for it.
I was wondering on at least the DOER program, you said it was a grant, which I've seen, and I don't know if you said any of the others are. Grants are particularly challenging to get into low-income housing tax credit development. Loans are much better, like 40-year loans at 0% interest. Do you know, I'm wondering if there was some advocacy we could do to allow for that to come into a project as a loan if requested?
That's a really great point. So I believe the DOER, they're taking some RFI, like they're taking feedback right now or questions. So that could be something that we could feed to them. The Mass Housing and MHP, the Climate Ready Housing Program, is it's structured the way you said. It's a long, it's a 0% interest long-term loan that won't be paid back, obviously. But yeah, I don't know how flexible the other ones are, but certainly I can follow up with the DOER information on the feedback so we can provide that. Great point.
Great, thanks.
Others? Well, again, Frank and Spencer, thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today on resilient buildings. And thank you everyone else for sharing your expertise and what you're learning and engaged in the field. We really appreciate it. And we'll share recordings, slides, the resources after this session. And then please, again, feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional related questions on resiliency, or more broadly, if you have ideas on energy cohort topics that you want to see this year. We've got some ideas, but welcome yours and what you want to see and what you want to learn about in energy decarbonization and affordable housing. So great. Well, I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your week and weekend ahead.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you, everyone. Great to see you all.